Oh, shoot, is it time to talk about the top 10 weapons in Fortnite? Sorry, I was just entering my creator code, my bad. So yes, I already did this video, and it is a good video. You know, it's one of my most popular videos. I'm glad so many people enjoyed it, and the information was good for its time. But a few major updates have occurred. One, they changed a lot of the perks of some of the weapons to where in the mag size reload perk, you can now have a damage slot. That didn't change much, but they also rebalanced every single weapon in the game. That's the big change of the 3 changes that occurred, and that is a huge one and the main reason that I had to remake this video. I want to say it right off the bat that my old top 10 video is still good. If you just followed it recently, if you even want to watch it today, it's of course still up, and it will be recommending good weapons. Nothing on that list is a bad weapon, it's just fine in that regard. However, the actual top 10 best weapons in the game are a little bit different, and I think I changed almost every single slot on this list. So of all 10 spots on my list, there are new additions to it and or a different weapon altogether. So yeah, all of the old weapons are still good, but the list has changed quite a bit. And the third major change was the new 6th perks. Now, I am still not an expert on that subject. I do consider myself quite informed. I have looked at a ton of weapons and user feedback. Anybody who's commented on my videos or my streams in the past month or so since this change has occurred has let me know about all of the best 6 perks in the game. So I do feel like I'm educated enough on the subject to rank some of my new weapons accordingly. There are weapons like the vacuum tube launcher, for example, which is not on today's list, but it is a phenomenal weapon. I made a video on it here. All of the weapons will have their own videos, by the way, linked below. I'll link my best perks playlist as well for all old and future uploads on these weapons. But for the vacuum tube launcher, it's a fantastic weapon that got even better because now it has area of effect damage with that chain lightning. And that's just a singular example showing how a lot of the new 6 perks have changed how I look at things and might impact this list. Now, before we get into the list, I also want to get into some very serious disclaimers just so that people don't get too heated at me in the comments. First and foremost, I have a calming disclaimer. That means every single weapon on today's list is good, okay? If it's in the 10th slot, this is better than, like, all of the other weapons in the game, seriously. And it's not that demanding, meaning, like, any weapon that's ranked higher than another weapon isn't strictly better. There are situational use cases. For example, the Obliterator is on this list, and it's not maybe better than the weapons that are below it on my list. It's just that the Obliterator has very specific uses that make it more relevant to the meta. And that sort of ties into another way that I rank my weapons. Damage is not the only metric. Attack speed can't be the only metric. There is no one way to measure every single weapon in the game, meaning there is no real data for how many weapons are being used by the players on a day-to-day, but what I'm going by is quote-unquote meta relevance. You know, these are the weapons that people are using or should be using in a day-to-day basis. I feel like that's the only true way to rank these weapons. They're not all measured the same, but for example, it's the way that I can put an Obliterator, the Bundlebuss, and the Thrasher on the same list. Those are 3 extremely different weapons for extremely different use cases. However, their individual use cases may impact their spot on this list. So that's how I'm going to be ranking the weapons today. I also want to mention that I, myself, and everybody else in the world is limited by their own experiences and their opinions. And people who have watched my videos before will know that I heavily rely on math. I usually like to come correct and explain my reasoning, but I have only used the weapons that I've used. No, I have not touched every single weapon in the game, but for the weapons I haven't touched, I've looked at their numbers and I kind of know where they lie, and I've also talked to tens of thousands of people through my streams and videos, and I've got a very, very large general idea of what weapons are being used in this game. But of course, there could be a change in the future updates, and that is where I will pin a comment below. I like to have this addition in this video because my old video went outdated. If there are any changes to the game or anything major worth bringing up, it will be pinned in the comments down below so you guys can stay up to date and make sure that this video is still relevant. So that means if you're watching in a year from now or whatever, you might want to scroll down and see if there's something to know. Now, my final point is going to draw into my first point, and that is that every single weapon on this list is good, and there are probably dozens of other weapons in this game that are also extremely strong. If you'd like to see the video where I rank all of the ranged weapons in the game, you can check that out in the description below. It's not as focused as this video, so I won't spend as much time on every individual weapon because that video would be over an hour long. Oops. And I included some weapons that were missed in that video in the description of that video, so you can check that out if you're interested. Just because they're not on my top 10 list today does not mean that they're not useful, and I will be making a best weapons video for all the ARs, SMGs, pistols, shotguns, all of the categories, traps, melees. I've already done all of those videos. They will be linked below, but they are outdated in the exact same way that my old top 10 list is outdated. Those videos still recommend good weapons, but there are so many new weapons and so many changes to the game worth mentioning that I will be redoing those videos as well. That is, of course, except for the best bows video, as this was recorded after all of the changes that affected my previous videos. Now, one last thing before we start the list, I want to discuss some exclusions. Now, I will not be putting any of the mythic weapons on this list. With the rebalance, some of them are beat out by some of the normal weapons in the game, like the Ravager and the Scourge are topped by some other weapons, but because they're mythic and because of the way they behave and because of their unique 6 perks, they might be beat in the strictly damage output department, but they also have ways that, you know, inch them back up onto the top. So if I included mythic weapons, they would sort of dominate much of this list, and I think everybody should know that these weapons are all already very, very powerful and don't really need any more praise. And the other thing that I will be mentioning are Founders weapons. I will not be bringing up a lot of them just because they're locked behind an old paywall that you can't even do anymore, and as of recording, you cannot get any more of these Founders weapons. If any more are announced or anything updates, obviously you can check the pinned comment below like I mentioned, but as of now, seeing as these weapons are unobtainable, they will not be on the list. And the Nocturno won't be included for both reasons. Not only is it completely unobtainable, but this thing hits about as hard as a mythic weapon. I'm not even kidding, they might as well make it a mythic weapon because it is going to be one of the strongest weapons in the game. It has the same DPS as the Siegebreaker, but with that 6 perk, oh my goodness, does it climb its way to the absolute top of the food chain. So the Nocturno and many of the other Founders weapons won't be on the list specifically, but I will be mentioning a couple throughout. Without further ado, let's get into our number 10 slot. And this is a tie. Yes, every single spot on my list today will have a tie. And that stems from the 12.0 rebalance that Epic did, where I call it a rebalance, where lots of weapons got buffed and all of the best weapons more or less got left alone. Of course, there are outliers, but ultimately Epic balanced out almost every weapon in the game. No, not all weapons are the same, but they are very, very, very close in performance across the board rather than some serious outliers like the Silent Specter and some really, really bad weapons like the Thrasher used to be. So because of that rebalance, every single spot on the list is going to have a partner or even more. And the Wraith is down here in the number 10 slot because it's good enough to be mentioned a lot by the community. A lot of people like it. It's a really popular weapon, but due to its lower damage than the other ARs and its slow fire rate, it doesn't quite hold up in the end game. It's still perfectly good. You're going to have to stand still to get a consistent spray, but it's not really going to be making much headway in the end game, so it's down here in the number 10 slot. I paired the Pepper Sprayer down here for the exact same reasons as the Wraith. It's a great SMG. It has great range. I think it has great accuracy. This is a phenomenal weapon, but frankly, due to just damage alone, it falls short of all of the other SMGs, so almost any other pick is going to be a higher damage output. As with the Wraith, it's a very popular weapon, and I do recommend using it, but it's going to be down here in the number 10 slot for now. Our number 9 slot is going to be absolutely dedicated to the Storm King, and this ties into the disclaimer that I mentioned earlier, where the Bundlebuss and the Surround Pound on their own are frankly unexceptional weapons. They both do great damage, don't let me talk them down too much, but honestly they wouldn't be on this list if it weren't for events, and that's the same way the Bundlebuss made my list last time. It has extremely high damage in an extremely short burst, it can pack a punch really quickly, and you can even switch between two of these to make it a very effective tool, but in normal missions that's really just not needed. You don't need it for anything other than mist monsters maybe. It's not going to be great for crowd clearing, etc. But for the specific use case of events, you know, with difficult enemies and the Storm King, for example, it is extremely useful, and I personally got through about 100 wins of the Storm King using the Bundlebuss before I got the Wrath. And the Surround Pound is there for the exact same reason. It is only on this list because of the Storm King, but the Storm King has become such an important fight and so integral to getting some of the mythic weapons that the Surround Pound is basically your gateway to some of the best weapons in the game, and for that reason alone, I felt like it deserved a spot on our list. For the number 8 slot, we're going to go with some of our utility picks. Obliterators are incredibly strong for a couple of reasons. One, they are basically an unlimited range pickaxe as they can instantly destroy any material in the game. They are very, very great for clearing out houses, making death pits, whatever you want to do, and the Neon Sniper can shoot through all structures, making it very, very useful. And that's basically the reason why it's on this list. They are very, very good for utility. They're very effective for shooting through walls and all of that. And of course, Sniper Defenders. If you don't already utilize Sniper Defenders, then I don't know what you're doing, but I set up 3 of these guys with Obliterators almost every single game, and while it is an expensive way to play, you can do it on some of the harder missions, and it will absolutely save you in a lot of situations. 3 Defenders with Obliterators are basically like super strong anti-air traps. They can shoot Flinger zombies out of the air, and of course, help you with the mini-bosses and the stronger enemies that might break through, and it really just makes it an awesome utility. And it's for that reason that I put the Obliterator tied with the Neon Sniper, because they essentially function the same. The Neon Sniper, while it doesn't break walls walls also does shoot through them and gives you a thermal scope to see enemies, so they're close enough to be tied in the number 8 slot. In our number 7 slot, we have a 3-way tie between the Siegebreaker, the Typewriter, and the Pain Train. And I put them here because all of these weapons behave very similarly. All of them are popular in similar regard. And if you look at the damage outputs, they're almost all identical. And I think the Pain Train is a little bit stronger than the both of these, but it sort of relies on its 6 perk to get up there, and its accuracy is a little so if your accuracy is low, then it kind of falls off because you won't be hitting all of your shots anyway, and I consider all 3 of these weapons to be equal. And I'm really happy to put the Siegebreaker on here because I feel like it's a fan favorite. It's the weapon that we all look to if you came over from Battle Royale, and it holds up. It was a really strong weapon even before the 12.0 update, and it's even better afterwards. So these are some of the better weapons in the game, and I don't really have much else to say. The Typewriter, Pain Train, and Siegebreaker, all perked correctly, will absolutely dominate pretty much any zone they're in, up to a degree, because as you might have noticed, we're down here in the number 7 slot. If you're in a 144 player, you might want to look elsewhere, but in the 124 zones and below, yes, I'm talking to you, early game players, any of these 3 weapons will do just fine. The number 6 slot is Paleo Luna. Yeah, we're talking about some of the melees in this game, and I'm only half kidding. These swords are good on their own, but I have mine triple and double attack speed because Paleo Luna's buff alone makes them so strong that they are the top melees in the entire game. And I did mention that I'd be covering a couple of Founders weapons, one of them being the Masamune, because it is very similar to these weapons in the way that it behaves and the way that you can perk it. So triple attack speed with Paleo Luna makes it very good. Obviously, the video for all 3 of these will be linked below where I explain different perks, and you'll note that I won't be recommending triple attack speed other than the Masamune because that was discovered later on. But I'd like to mention that you don't need Paleo Luna for these weapons to be good. They're still going to be in the top slot. It's also important to draw attention to something I mentioned earlier, in that the Spectral Blade can actually be better than the Ravager. If you perk both weapons just the same with Whiteout Fiona in support and Paleo Luna in your lead, this will be the optimal damage output. And if you have the stacking damage perk that I'm highlighting here on the Spectral Blade, it will actually overtake the Ravager against normal enemies. But as I mentioned with the special 6 perks, if you use the right click ability to send a surge of extra damage with the Ravager, it will sort of win in most situations. But it's good to know that a normal weapon like the Spectral Blade can be better than a mythic weapon if you perk it properly. I do want to give huge thanks to Cthulhu, a good friend of mine. He did a lot of the math for this. So because of all of that, I've placed these weapons in the number 6 slot. Now, we're only in the number 5 spot, but you know things are getting serious when the Xenon bow is highlighted. Yes, I supercharged my Xenon bow because it is one of the best weapons in the game, but as you'll see later, our top 4 slots are incredibly competitive. I will go out and say the Xenon bow, the powder keg, and the vacuum tube bow all do perform very similarly and are equally worthy of their location, except that the Xenon bow shooting through targets makes it just an absolute monster. If you guys have used this thing with Stoneheart Farah and you've been using the Xenon bow, then you don't need me to explain to you that this thing is just an absolute powerhouse. I have cleared super encampments with this thing with a breeze. I was actually shocked when I got this footage recording for the Best Bows video that this thing absolutely annihilated everything. It just did everything. This was a 140 zone, for goodness sakes, and this weapon never lets me down. Now, the powder keg and the vacuum tube bow sort of live in its shadow, but these are equally good weapons that all have great area of effect damage, even as a bow, and are some of the best weapons in the entire game. And if used correctly, hint hint, link below, you can use these weapons to the best of their abilities and have a great time. Now, our number 4 slot is a little busy, and that's because the 12.0 update rebalanced the shotguns to basically make them all complete powerhouses. I will mention the Ground Pounder, Husk Buster, and the Stampede, because the Husk Buster is just the scavenger version of the Stampede, so the stats in the damage department are completely identical, and the Popshot are all completely identical damage output in the base damage, meaning once you apply perks and get into the end game, they start to stray away a little bit, but on the basic level, if you take the damage divided by the time spent reloading, these weapons, all 4 of them are completely identical. And the Maverick and the Pulsar 9000 and the Big Shot and the Vacuum Tube Shotgun are all incredibly good as well. The Ground Pounder is fast firing and very powerful. And if you add damage to each of its shots and give it a little bit of area of effect damage, you basically have the Big Shot, which fires twice and reloads after every shot. If you're not looking for single target damage, then the Pulsar will absolutely annihilate everything always. The Pop Shot performs very similarly to the Ground Pounder, and the Maverick performs very similar to the Big Shot in the fact that it can shoot in a cone and affect many enemies at once. Not to mention the Vacuum Tube Shotgun is sort of on its own, shooting in a 3-round burst, eliminating everything in sight. Pair this thing with a Chain Lightning perk and you will be eliminating everything. All of these weapons are very good. There are other amazing shotguns in the game that you should definitely check out, but I'll be making a video on that later down the line. I have never used a weapon set that felt more fun to use. Yes, we're only in the number 4 slot, and I'm already saying that, and that's because, you know, other weapons get more expensive and a little bit different, but shotguns are incredibly strong strong and potentially could even deserve a higher spot on this list. I just feel like their limited range makes them a little bit tougher to use, and they're not quite as popular with the community sort of for that reason. So I think the number 4 spot is acceptable, but there is no understating just how incredible these weapons are. Now, the number 3 spot is one of the reasons that I actually wanted to remake this list, and it is dedicated to the SMGs, and you'll notice there's a bit of a shakeup. The 12.0 update did a lot for the Thrasher, making it better than the Silent Specter in almost every way. I explained more about it on its best perks video that is linked below, but it is essentially just the best SMG in the game right now, except that the Founder's Quickshot exists. However, as I mentioned, this is a Founder's weapon, and I explained why those won't really be counted on this list, and it's essentially the same weapon. This is perked a little differently for the video that I made on it, but yeah, they perform very, very similarly. The Founder's Quickshot is essentially just an upgraded version of that, but because it's Founders, we won't be counting it here today. And the Riptide is also essentially a clone of the Thrasher, except that the Riptide is the Scavenger variant, and for whatever reason, breaking the mold of most Scavenger weapons, it has about a 3% less overall damage than the Thrasher does. So I'm really not sure about that. It has a little bit more impact, but the Thrasher is essentially just a better Riptide in every way. And that leads us to our remaining 4 SMGs. However, the Bobcat sort of falls short of the Silent Specter. I was led to believe for a long time that these weapons were essentially identical, and they do behave very, very similarly, but the Silent Specter seems to beat out the Bobcat in every single damaging situation. However, the Bobcat is a little bit more versatile with the perks that you have available, so you might be able to make it edge it out in certain situations, but because it has a 3.3 reload speed, you can't really utilize all of its damaging perks. It's for that reason that the Bobcat really won't be on my number 3 spot. It would better be tied in the number 7 slot alongside the Siegebreaker, Typewriter, and Pain Train, seeing as the damage is more similar to the Siegebreaker. That being said, the Bobcat is still a phenomenal weapon. Don't look too hard at my rankings here, as it's still going to perform amazingly in game, and that leaves us to our last 3. However, there's one more caveat. The Lightning Pistol only beats the Thrasher in damage. Yes, it's actually stronger than the Thrasher against water enemies. Because the Lightning Pistol is locked to nature, you can't really make it viable anywhere else. If it's nature on nature, it's still going to do about as much damage as an energy weapon would, and the Thrasher would take over again. So our number 3 slot essentially boils down to the Thrasher, the Silent Specter, the Bobcat, and the Lightning Pistol, kind of. Now, in the number 2 slot, we're going to talk about something that the astute amongst you might have noticed was missing in the number 3 slot. Beast, where's the Hemlock? I thought that thing was insane. Where's the Ratatat? Isn't that kind of good? I'm sure none of you were asking about the Ratatat because it's sort of a sleeper pick. Did you know that this thing is basically one of the strongest weapons in the entire game? Yeah, it's not in the number 2 slot on accident. This thing, perked correctly, can absolutely annihilate. I have it triple crit damage because I recorded in my video Totally Rockin' Out, and I don't count Totally Rockin' Out in my videos, but this is one of the very few weapons where you can run crit rating, crit damage, and fire rate, and perked correctly, this thing is just the best SMG in the game, kind of. Let me explain. If you have Causes Affliction or Slowed and Snared and perk it accordingly with the matching 6 perk, it'll be a little bit worse than the Thrasher. But if you have the new 6 perk with the ramping crit rating, you can perk this in a specific way to make it be a little bit better than the Thrasher once it's wound up. And there are other ways to perk it, like I have here with Totally Rockin' Out, where it'll be absolutely monstrous, but Totally Rockin' Out kind of doesn't count. So the Ratatat is only better than the Thrasher if you have the right perks, and even then it's only better sometimes. That said, because this weapon is essentially a chameleon with the kind of perk options you have on this thing, I am putting in the number 2 slot, but it needs to be strictly stated that this weapon is not specifically better than the weapons below it. It just has the potential to be significantly better. So it's a little weird to explain that. I explained it much better in its specific video link below, but it's definitely worth knowing. And a new face on our list, a weapon that did not exist when I last made my top 10 video, the Floor Flusher is on this list with another caveat. Yes, the number 2 slot is dedicated to weapons that are technically better in certain situations. Now, the Floor Flusher, if you have the matching 6 perk and the element, is over 300,000 DPS. I've stayed away from specific numbers a lot here, but for reference, the Thrasher has about a base 245,000 DPS with my specific stats, and the Floor Flusher can beat it by a lot, almost 60,000, and that is a huge deal. The Floor Flusher against a nature enemy in this circumstance, or depending on your 6 perk, you can't have the crit rating. It is not better than the weapon deals bonus damage. If you're against water, fire, nature, and the element is perked to compound on top of that, the Floor Flusher is a king. It is very, very, very strong in those certain circumstances. However, in a normal mission, you're never going to be shooting shooting one element the entire time, so it doesn't always stay on top. There are better generalists, but it should be noted that the Floor Flusher is a sleeping giant if you've never really tried it out. And the Hemlock is essentially in the same position. Its normal damage output, perked kind of as I'm showing here, is essentially the same, but a little bit lower than the Silent Specter and the Thrasher. It's a pretty good, but not exceptional weapon, in that it'll still absolutely shred. The Hemlock is a fan favorite for a very good reason, but it's still going to fall short of its brothers. But with the landing 5 hits in a row causes a small explosion 6 perk, it can be better. Now, area of effect damage is really hard to measure. It's impossible to know just how many enemies you're going to be hitting all the time. Sometimes that explosion hits 1 enemy, sometimes it hits 10 of them. You really just can't account for that in the math. I would have to give you a dozen different numbers to even look at that. But what's unique here is you're going to kill most enemies very, very quickly, so it's not going to matter most of the time. But on the bigger targets, when you can land that 5th hit without eliminating them, that's 70% of your damage. Extra chunk does make this weapon quite a bit better than some of the other SMGs in the game by a good margin. It's not 70% better, it's like 1/5 of 70% better, so it can edge out some of the other SMGs in the game when you're shooting at bigger targets like mist monsters, smashers, mini bosses. And because that explosion can hit enemies around it, not only is it single target damage better than the others, but it's hitting multiple enemies as well. So it's for that reason that the Hemlock is sometimes the best SMG in the game, but so is the Ratatat sometimes. It really depends. So the number 3 slot was essentially the best SMGs all around, and this number 2 slot was the best SMGs sometimes, and then of course the Floor Flusher bringing the assault rifles back up on top. Now, this number 1 slot is going to come as no surprise and is going to include a lot less confusion than the last few slots on this list, and that's, of course, rocket launchers. I put these in the number 1 slot because I think it's obvious. These are incredibly expensive weapons, so they will never be your primary, but everybody knows that when you pull out a rocket launcher, it's because shit just got real and you need to clear up a mess, and that is where we are going to be talking about, hands down, the strongest weapons in the game. I have the Storm King's Wrath favorited here because obviously it has like an honorary spot amongst these weapons, but because it's a mythic, it's kind of sort of not on our list. But the De-Atomizer, the Metal Marauder, the Santa's Little Helper, the Popshot kinda, and the Sodbuster sometimes are clear candidates for the crown on this list. I do think, on a personal note, the De-Atomizer is the best generalist. It's what I use the most because it clears the most amount of enemies the most efficiently, and it is an extremely strong weapon to use. But the Santa's Little Helper and the Metal Marauder are very similar candidates in the fact that they have one single explosion that affects a number of enemies, extremely strong. It does a lot of damage in one punch. The Metal Marauder is basically the same as the Santa's Little Helper in the same regard. It does very similar damage. It's a little bit stronger if you're hitting it with low health, and because of that 6 perk, it gets a little tricky. You can change the 6 perk nowadays to do damage to nature enemies, and that can make this weapon an absolute monster for the same reason that the Sawbuster will be, and for the same reason that the Floor Flusher was. And that's that if you switch off of this physical element, make it fire, switch that 6 perk to nature, which I don't necessarily recommend doing. Core Reperk is very scarce as I'm recording this, but that will do an absolute ton of damage, and you can swap this 5th perk for something a little bit more useful, like putting your reload speed down here and switching to an extra damage perk. You can see that if it's perked correctly, shooting a nature enemy, it can be incredibly strong, way more powerful than the Santa's Little Helper. But of course, because it has so many little caveats going along with it, the Metal Marauder isn't strictly better in any one way, but it's very tied with the Santa's Little Helper in the way that I have it here. Now, the Popshot was kind of an because this weapon says it's doing whatever it's doing, but it's almost always doing more than double. So I am very suspicious that it's bugged. However, the De-Atomizer is sort of the same way. You might have seen that it says that it's doing like 45,000. It's almost always doing more, and the Popshot is very similar. I have some pretty clean footage of it showing that it's going to be doing about 500,000 and then just not hitting for anything less than 1.2 or 1.3 million damage. This thing, if it goes unchecked, is insane. It is way stronger than anything that should exist in this game. People have run this triple crit damage of totally rocking out, and that can get out of hand very, very fast. So it deserves a position in the number 1 spot, but that may change in the future. Of course, you can check the pinned comment below if there's any news on that. And the Sodbuster is a very similar situation. If I compare the numbers here, you can see that it's hitting for about identical to the Santa's Little Helper. They are essentially the same. But if I'm shooting against a fire enemy with the one that I have here, it will be doing, well, essentially 44% more, but kind of more than that. It's it's not specific, but it will be doing a lot more because of the elements here. And it's just a very, very good weapon because you can get all 3 elements on this. So if you have 3 Sodbusters and you pick one for the mission at hand, it is, in my opinion, a lot better than the Sentinel's Little Helper because it's doing identical damage normally, but even more damage if you have the right element. A lot of people will point out that I'm running physical on a lot of my launchers here, and that's because I usually run with the basic attitude that these weapons are hitting so hard that it doesn't matter for the normal enemies, and the hard enemies are going to be shooting the Storm King, the mist monsters in the Storm King, which are all physical, or Zappy Faces and Takers are always physical, Flingers are always physical, Smashers are only sometimes elemental, and even then an AR or a more prolonged damage output weapon, or like an SMG, would be a lot better of a choice than a rocket launcher. So in every single circumstance where I'm actually using a rocket launcher to eliminate things, physical tends to be the better option for me. Of course, the Sodbuster, for, as I just explained, specific reasons, is better to match the element, not to mention the Sodbuster, along with the other Art Deco weapons, can't actually have physical or energy anyway, which is funny to me because you're going to want to match the element to your 6 perk regardless, but you don't have the choice to do anything else otherwise. So yeah, those are our number 1 picks. That is the top 10 list. I've been recording for over an hour, so I have no idea how long this video is, but hopefully this was insightful. There will be no honorable mentions at the end of this list though. I feel like it's pretty fleshed out, and like I mentioned earlier, any weapon that should have been mentioned in this video will be covered in the subsequent category videos later, meaning if there's an SMG that I should have brought up, or there's an assault rifle that I should have brought up, or where are the traps on this list, Beast? Well, traps are extremely different from the normal weapons, so I don't even think they should be mentioned here, but regardless, all of that will be mentioned in their own videos down the line. This has been a tremendous amount of work, so if you guys want to support the channel, feel free to use code Mista to check out. You guys can become a channel member here if you guys want to support me even further, get some nice perks. I am streaming on Twitch nowadays though, so those emotes won't always be usable in my YouTube chats, but hopefully someday they enable it for the comments down below. If you guys want to follow me on Twitch, I greatly appreciate it. The streams are a pretty good time. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a nice day. And then